Good morning, everybody. I hope that you are excited about class today. So, we are going to talk about tone. Tone is a writer's attitude towards his or her subject. So, it's not what you said, but it's how you said it. So, thinking about tone and nonfiction specifically, and I'm sure you've heard of tone and analyzed the tone in literary texts in other classes before, but we're looking at nonfiction and building on our skills that we've been working on, such as identifying main idea and supporting details, identifying the speaker, and now we're looking at tone. So by the end of class today, you will be able to identify how an author's viewpoint impacts the tone of a nonfiction passage. And using a tone word list, you will be able to identify the tone of a passage and support your choice of tone using textual evidence or quotes pieces of the text. So before we get into the nitty gritty of today, I would like you guys to go to the Edpuzzle, and it's about 2.5 minutes. There are 5 questions, and this is just a basic review of tone. Again, because it's probably been a little while since you've talked about it. So just a review of tone. Okay, so at this point, I would have students go to the Edpuzzle, which is, again, it's like 2.5 minutes long. It's just a review of tone. There are 5 built-in questions to help them take some notes, just so we have a working definition and some background on tone before we get into the lesson for today. So this is their warm-up. Now that you guys have looked at tone and the basics, let's get into it in a little more detail. So again, tone is a writer's attitude towards his or her subject or the audience. And writers express that attitude towards what they are writing about, their subject, through diction. And we've talked about diction before. Remember, diction is just a fancy way of saying words. So think diction, dictionary. When a writer picks words, those words have feelings that they come with. And those feelings can be positive or negative. That is called connotation. So when you think about the connotation of a word, I want you to think that words are loaded. So they carry an emotional weight behind them. So an example would be curvy. Curvy has this positive feeling behind it versus saying like heavy. Heavy has a more negative feeling behind it. So a couple more examples. Athlete. Athlete has a positive connotation to it. When you hear athlete, you think of somebody who's healthy, who's in shape. And so if I'm writing an article about student athletes, my tone or my attitude towards my subject of kids who play sports at school is respectful. Versus if I used a word like jock. Jock has a negative connotation. When we hear a word like jock, we think of people who are lazy, not very smart, not super invested in school. And so, again, if I'm a writer writing about kids who play sports at school, then my attitude towards those students is very critical. So, words create a writer's tone. Here's some more examples. So, if you got a gift from somebody, from somebody you were either really into or really not into, it's pretty clear how you feel about them based on your response. So let's say a girl got flowers from a boy. If she was like, oh my gosh, like he gave me flowers and it was like just the best thing in the whole world, we would know that she's excited, that she's optimistic, that she thinks like, oh, maybe he's going to go out with me. Versus if she's like, he gave me flowers, then we know she's not really into him. So a couple more examples. That movie was amazing. I was laughing so hard I cried. The tone here is very praising. Makes me want to go see that movie. Instead of something like, you can only watch stupid humor for so long before you walk out of the theater. The tone there is very judgmental or critical. So words like amazing imply praise versus words like stupid, which imply judgment or criticism. So again, those words create the writer's attitude. Another example, the principal just called to say our son was in a fight. I can't believe he would do that. Versus, I'm proud of Billy for sticking up for himself. That bully had it coming. Okay, so can't believe he would do that has a very like vexed or frustrated attitude behind it. Instead of something, we see the word proud, had it coming. That's kind of more joyful, elated. Oh, finally, that he did what he needed to do. So when you think tone of voice, I also want you to think about the words that a writer uses specifically. And a writer's purpose impacts their tone. We've talked a lot about purpose. We've moved beyond persuade, inform, entertain, and we've looked more specifically at nonfiction texts and their purposes. So if my goal is to persuade, to get somebody to do something, then my tone might be very like passionate. I care about this thing. I want you to do it. My tone also might be urgent if it's something that needs to happen right away. If I'm trying to get somebody to do something, I'm advising you. My tone might be encouraging. It also could be pleading, like I'm begging. If I am defending a position, let's say that I'm defending my position on parenting to somebody who doesn't agree with me, my tone might be condescending to them. I can't believe you don't think what I like. Or it might be assertive or a little pushy. If my purpose is to get support for something, again, my tone might be encouraging. If I'm arguing with somebody in my text, like an editorial arguing one side or another, the tone might be aggravated. If my purpose is to criticize something, let's say there's a terrible new movie, I might have a judgmental tone. If I'm straight up informing someone of a topic, so more of that expository nonfiction, my tone is going to be more matter of fact or objective. And that just means without bias. I'm just giving the facts as it is. And here I am as a teacher. Often my tone when I'm writing things for students is didactic or informative. It's very instructive. So tone is closely linked to word choice. And that has always comes back to author's purpose. What is the author's goal? All right, so some tips for tone. What is the type of passage? If it's an editorial, you might, you know that the tone is going to be very clear versus if it's an informational text, it's often a little bit harder to identify the tone. What's the subject? Is it controversial? That's going to impact the tone. Is it something silly or lighthearted or heavy? Who is the audience? Is it students? Is it adults? Is there a really specific tailored group of people the writer's talking to? People who agree with him or don't agree with him? What are the most important words? Are they repeated? What connotations, like we did at the beginning, do they have? What feelings do you get from the imagery or the figurative language? So if there's similes or metaphors or imagery, can you see them in your mind? And then what weight, like connotation, do they carry? What feelings do they have? Is the narrator being ironic or sarcastic? Are there hints that he or she is over exaggerating? Does the narrator speaker make jokes? If so, the tone might be humorous. And if the speaker were speaking aloud, like I did with those two examples about Billy and about the flowers, what tone of voice would he or she use? Okay, so we have our tone word list. So I want you to open up your tone word list and you're going to use it for this next activity. So at this point, I would have students go into the learning management system and use tone words and work in groups. And I would ability group students. In this situation, I would group students with like one really strong student, a middle student, and then a couple of weak students. And I would have them listen to this song by Michael Jackson, Man in the Mirror, and they would use their tone word list to identify the tone. And there's a shift in tone in the song. So they would look at the beginning and at the end and decide his tone. So this is their practice that they're doing together. And then we would debrief, this activity. All right, now that you have listened to Michael Jackson's song and you've worked in your group to identify the tone of the beginning and then the shift to identify the tone of the end, let's share out. And so at this point, I would call on different groups and I would have them tell me the tone that they chose for the beginning and the end and kind of justify or explain why. And we would use norms that we'd established at the beginning of the school year where there in each group is like a speaker who like speaks out or shares out, and those kind of rules I would have students establish at the beginning of the year. Okay, So at this point, I would have students open the article that we had previously read last class. Teenagers are changing the world. They should be allowed to vote. And students would already have done some main idea work, identifying speaker, identifying main idea, identifying supporting details. So they're returning to the article for a second read, um, possibly even a third read. And that way we can like really specifically dig into word choice. So now we're going to take what you have read last class and we are going to practice together looking at how to take this skill of identifying tone into a nonfiction text. And so let's read this passage aloud, this excerpt from Teenagers Changing the World, They Should Be Allowed to Vote. And then I want you to use that tone word list to identify the words and phrases that describe the tone. So at this point, I would read this section aloud to them, and I'm using Nearpod, and I would have them in the Nearpod list a couple of tone words. And so persuasive, passionate, something like that. Um, and then I would share out their answers. There's a feature in Nearpod that allows you to share out student answers without names, and that way we could kind of debrief. So now that we've decided that the tone of this section is passionate, or a synonym for passionate, I want you to read the excerpt again, this time by yourself. And I want you to choose a couple of words or phrases, and you can copy and paste that prove that the tone is passionate. So same thing here, I would give them a couple of minutes to identify key words or phrases that would prove that the tone is passionate. So we're taking that skill and bringing it to a nonfiction text. And I can see every student's response that's in class. Now that we've looked at two examples, you did one with a group with Michael Jackson, and we've done two examples together with our article, it's time for you to practice on your own. So the culminating learning activity for today is in the learning management system, and it is an 8-question quiz. So it's 8 excerpts of different nonfiction articles, and you are identifying the tone of those passages, or you are identifying keywords or phrases that would prove the tone. You can only take this quiz once, so make sure that you move slowly and you have that handy dandy tone word list if you need it. So you can use the tone word list if you're not sure what a word means. You are looking to get a 7 out of 8, and that indicates proficiency to me, that you have mastered the skill of identifying tone in a nonfiction text. So at this point, students would go to the learning management system and take the quiz. I would have the text set up with accessibility features. So there would be read aloud for students whose accommodations provide read aloud. I also would probably create 2 different versions of this quiz, one for my students who are advanced or higher proficient, and those would be 2 things, probably slightly longer passages and more dense or difficult. And I might try to throw in some words that aren't on that handy dandy tone word sheet. And then for my students with IEPs and my students who are in that kind of like developing group, I would have passages that are shorter, that are clearer, and give them, possibly even for my students with IEPs, only 3 multiple choice answer choices instead of 4. And so I'm really looking for like a 7 out of 8 to see proficiency, but a 6 out of 8 indicates that they're on their way to mastery. So working in this manner, I've done a couple of things. I have gotten kids warmed up with the Edpuzzle. So I would have data from the Edpuzzle that they understood like the basics of tone. And so if anybody like bombed that, I would know I need to go back and do some reteaching specifically for those kids. I have group students in higher, lower ability groups, and I would use like breakout rooms in that situation and be like popping into the breakout rooms. And if it's a co-taught class, I would have my co-teacher doing the same thing as well. So I can kind of see what kids are talking about and who is talking and who isn't participating. Then I would have the responses from the Nearpod where it indicates if students are understanding how to take that skill from, what we've talked about, a song, now to like a real world nonfiction text. And finally, I'd have the quiz with the nonfiction text pieces to use, again, to indicate who really has mastered the skill or who needs reteaching.